Welcome, everyone. I'm going to get started. My name is Paget Hetherington, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is part of a webinar series that Gaggle hosts entitled Student Wellness. So all different sorts of topics related to trying to keep our students safe and healthy and happy. Today's topic, as you know, is entitled Selfies and Explicit Content. So that's what our focus is of today's webinar. The purpose is that we want to offer you some insight, some guidance, and some strategies to better help you understand and support your students regarding the dangers, ramifications, and issues related to both the sharing and the receiving of explicit materials. So that's what our focus is today. This webinar is for you, the educators that we partner with across the country. We're so glad that you're joining us. We really appreciate you. You all are on the front lines every day trying to help keep your students happy, safe and healthy. So this is just an opportunity for all of you to better understand this particular topic. With us today, we have four very amazing panelists. So first of all, we have Dr. Lisa Stroman. She is a psychologist and author. She's also the founder of the Digital Citizen Academy, and her website link is there. We have Matt Joy, who is the Wisconsin ICAC Task Force Commander. So ICAC stands for the Internet Crimes Against Children organization, and he's been part of that group for quite some time. So we're really pleased to have Mr. Joy with us today. Then we have Ryan Pletnick. Ryan is a principal at a K-8 public school in Phoenix, Arizona. So thank you, Ryan, for joining us. And we have Heather Durkak. Heather's part of the Gaggle team. She's the VP of Operations, and she's going to kick us off. She's going to be sharing with us some insights that we see at Gaggle based on the over 5.2 million students that we're serving across the country. So we have a specific lens into what's going on with kids, and that's where she's going to come in and share some things with us. So a few housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, so if you're familiar, great. If you're not familiar with Zoom, there in your panel, there's a Q&A button where you can click and ask questions. There's also a chat, and I see a lot of you have already figured that out, so great. But please engage with us in the chat, ask questions, offer your insights. We want to hear from you as well. So let's definitely go there and communicate with each other. And then what we'll be doing after these four people share their experiences and insights, we will be opening it up to questions. So I'll come back on at that point and we'll ask the various panelists the questions that you may have. So send those to us via the questions box, or you can even just ask in the chat. And then lastly, just so everybody knows, we will be sending out a follow-up to this webinar with the slides that you'll be seeing. So you don't have to take all kinds of notes, just listen in and learn from the speakers. And we will also be sending you the recording. So you will have that. So you will get that in the next couple of days. All right. So with that, I am now going to hand it over to Heather Durkak from Gaggle. So Heather, over to you.
Thank you, Paget, and thank you for organizing this webinar on this important topic. As I was working with the team to gather the data for the webinar, I kept thinking about a recent situation from one of our district partners. Gaggle had identified a conversation that was taking place over email with one of their middle school students with a non-district email address. The conversation escalated to the point where this outside email address was giving instructions to this girl on how to position a camera, what pictures to take, and then getting even more specific of what parts of her body that they were wanting to see as far as on how to use the camera and where to take the pictures. So we had sent this over to the district, and they reached out to Gaggle to ask for advice on how to handle this and what to do next. And so I was quickly in touch with Matt Joy, who you will hear from shortly. He gets a lot of my questions that are in this realm. Um, and so what Matt did was very quickly got in touch with his ICAC partners in the region of the country where this school district was located. Um, and the district was able to get the experts involved quickly. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we're all talking today. These are not situations that any of us have to deal with like on our own or figure out what to do next. There are so many great partnerships between Gaggle and ICAC and NCMEC that really set us up to do things quickly and accurately when we're dealing with this type of content. Um, Moving on, now that you've had a moment to look at these numbers and digest them a little bit, I really just wanted to hit on some overall data of what we're seeing in the content that we review. So like you, we have been busy as we've increased the number of students we are protecting. You see that that's increased by 22.4% over this past year. There's also, as we're seeing, more accounts being issued, more devices going home, usage is increasing as well. So the rate that students are using these accounts you're providing on the devices you've been given them, increase of that 85.4%. Overall increase from where we were on volume last year to this year, 127%. So that's why I say we're all busy. There's lots of content going back and forth, and the students are really putting those accounts and those devices to use for sure. So now as we look at the next slide, really to take this one step, further is to see what we are reviewing as far as the topic that we are discussing today, and that is the nudity and sexual content category. One key item to note here is that while our total amount of content increased, which does tie to the increase in students we are protecting, the amount of use per student also increased over the pandemic year compared to the year before. And so that's what I wanted to make clear with that 85.4%. But to focus more on what we have here, we see that increase in nudity and sexual content. And we saw that go up by 76.1%. And again, it's important to note that this is the rate per 1,000 students. So that accounts for those increase in the students we're protecting as well. So this is overall where that just dramatic increase has taken place. The other piece of how usage of these district provided accounts shifted over the past year is, instead of the activity being mostly geared towards that school day, this past year it has been very heavy into the evenings. And that's where you see this 52.2% occurring in those after hours timeframes. Kids were at home, the devices were at home, and there was not as big of a disconnect in, I think what would be a personal device and a school issue device. Those devices got to stay with the kids to do homework in their rooms at night, possibly. And that's why we saw that usage go up in those evening hours. We actually at Gaggle shifted schedules of our safety team to be able to cover the activity when the students were actually producing the content. And then you'll notice here quarantine and blocking emails. Again, kind of like mentioning NCMEC and ICAC, we've got ways to add in that protection. We're not in this alone. And Gaggle offers this quarantine on the Google Drive files, meaning anytime we see that inappropriate image, we will quarantine that file. That means the students can no longer access the file. They also cannot share that file. And then Google and Microsoft, we will block those emails so that email doesn't get to a student with the inappropriate image, or they're not able to send it out sharing that image. So that's a key piece to limit the ability to view and to continue to share these images. Now, I know you can, it's pretty easy to come up with that visual when we're talking about the pictures, the images of that inappropriate content. But if we go to the next slide, I just want to make you aware of some other content that we are reviewing for and that we will let our administrators know that is being sent and shared. And so here are two recent examples of communication that we did let administrators know about. And so you see one is that an email, you see we've removed that student's name, talking about asking for nudes. And the second one is in a Google Doc where students were communicating back and forth. And I should add on this one that mentions Snapchat, this was a conversation between middle school students. So hopefully with seeing some of those numbers, the type of content we're reviewing really sets us up for the rest of these conversations today.
Super, thank you, Heather. So what we're gonna do now, before we go to Matt Joy, is we're gonna have a poll question for the audience. So here's our question, and this relates to some of what Heather was just talking about in terms of our data. So you'll see the poll question would have come up as a pop-up on your screen. The question is, what percentage of children under the age of 10 have seen pornography? Is it more than 20%, more than 10%, more than 5%, more than 40%? So we'll give you all a couple of seconds here to give us your responses, and we'll see what everybody thinks. You know, and it's interesting based on what Heather was talking about, you know, some of the things we're seeing at Gaggle. All right. Rebecca, do you think we have a good response? All right, there we are. So that should have popped up. Okay, interesting. So 54% of you all said more than 20%, which is in fact the correct answer. So good job. 35% of you said more than 40%. So that's interesting too. So, you know, we're definitely all feeling a heightened awareness of this particular issue with selfies and explicit content. So that's our poll question. And now I want to shift. I'm going to hand it over to Matt Joy. And so Matt, over to you. Oh, I'm sorry. Got my order wrong. I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Pletnick. Ryan, go ahead and talk us through what you're seeing. Sorry about that.
No problem, Padgett. Thank you. And I would love to say those numbers seem surprising. You know, I asked my staff the same question, and the same results pretty much came up. Which, if we think about it, is scary. Just the threats that we're seeing as educators and as administrators, our landscape has changed. I asked my staff what the average age of a child's chronic exposure to pornography was. The mean was over 13. And if we look at statistics on that last slide, it's 11 years old. So based upon the current environment, teacher and administrator job functions have changed. There are challenges to the current educational constructs, but there's also challenges that lie ahead of us like never before. It's essential we educate the whole child, meeting the social and emotional needs, but as we as educators know, we can't reach the student's full potential without meeting their basic physical and psychological needs. So where does our focus go? As educators, we're having to adjust to COVID protocols. We have new technology we're implementing. We're hitting learning gaps. We're going to keep hitting learning gaps, and we see an increased need for emotional support, which Lisa will be talking about later. So where do we focus teacher education? Teachers are in a new environment, and we're asking them to develop new skill sets, refine delivery models, while at the same time being aware of these new threats to students. Threats to students that occur on platforms that they may not know, or they may not know anything about those platforms. So these issues have multiple sides, and I'm going to look at it from two stakeholder groups. First, the teachers, and then the students. So let's talk about the teachers. Multiple states have identified teacher retention is a significant issue. My state, Arizona, not only research can tell you that, but I can definitely tell you that too, that retention and recruitment is a significant issue. Yet the most important determinant of an educational outcome is an effective teacher. So pressure on teachers has led to an adverse effect on recruitment and retention, and therefore it's led to an adverse effect on our students. So now school districts have to find ways to lessen costs. They also have to find ways to offer supportive environments to improve teacher recruitment and retention. So the challenge lies on us of how do we influence working conditions, feeling supported, quality professional development, and still impact climate and atmosphere to help our students more than ever. Teachers have different technology or knowledge bases with technology in other areas, resulting us to have to personalize and differentiate professional development more than ever to meet teachers' needs and to meet the environmental challenges that I spoke about and will speak about. Teachers need to expand knowledge bases to expand their job functions at this point. So we need to provide them the tools to adapt to the new environment. This isn't only for the teachers, but it's also for the students that they serve to ensure that all students are given the opportunity to reach their full potential. Remember, the most important determinant of student outcomes is an effective teacher. So let me talk about students. Now, my district has gone to one-to-one technology where every student receives a device for learning. This has increased the ability to electronically communicate and access information. Like Heather stated, students can now take home these devices. Seems like a huge advantage, but it has to be if a student is guided to utilize the technology responsibly. An example of what could happen. For this example, I'm going to call her Sarah. Sarah's a 13-year-old girl. Sarah plays sports. Sarah goes to class frequently and doesn't miss class. Sarah has a great group of friends. So what we think of a typical 13-year-old girl. One day we had a boy come into the office concerned about an email he received from Sarah. The email contained explicit content and sexually explicit materials. When we called Sarah into the office, we searched her Chromebook history. Her history revealed over 3 months of soliciting sex from 6 different students and over 100 pages of email threads. This occurred over 3 months. Now, not one boy came forward over those 3 months until the last one we spoke to. Now, that's concerning to us on its own. But as we searched your account, we found multiple screenshots in Google Docs for communication. A new trend that you may be seeing as well is sharing a Google Doc to communicate between students. So we searched the Google Doc history and noted conversations that occurred during class time and outside of class time, asking the boys if they would go join her during class in the restroom or outside of school to meet up somewhere. So now, as the boys became sick of these advances, instead of telling someone, they became negative and began to harass and make fun of the girl on emails and individual and group Google Docs. Now, none of this was headed in a good direction. Parents were called in, and while working with them, pornography was found on personal home devices. Now, for certainly, home concerns are now bleeding into school concerns, and fellow educators, as technology has increased, I think we can see this more and more. So what everyone thought was a regular 13-year-old girl, definitely there were different issues lying. underneath. So educators, we must have a better understanding of threats to students and the social emotional impact those threats cause, the long and short term. But educators must understand how tools for productivity can actually be counterproductive. We also have to understand how social media and communication, technology communication systems impact our student lives. As educators, we have a tall task. What tools, what resources, what professional development can be offered to assist our teachers to combat these threats and protect our students? As we have run into technology concerns, my school, we've begun implementing and outlining strategies to proactively address the concerns. Utilizing resources such as Digital Citizenship Academy can educate the students and parents while attempting to lessen the load on our teachers. Through planning and initial implementation, we have found not only will these programs impact our students, but the parents as well. But the nice side piece to it is our teachers are educated too. So as educators, if we don't provide safety supports for our kids like Sarah, for the tools we provide them, we're not fully doing our job in educating the whole child.
All right, thank you very much, Ryan. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matt Joy. So Matt, over to you for your part.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Paget. Appreciate that. And thank you for the opportunity. I've actually been taking notes here this afternoon as well, and there's other things I'd like to cover. There's just so much to think about when we talk about this topic, this issue. And I think what I'd like to do first to start out is talk just a little bit about the ICAC task force, because there is good news. Every state, every region in the United States has an ICAC task force. And I would strongly encourage, if not urge, each of you to reach out to your ICAC in your state or region and learn about the resources, learn about folks that you can partner with, and have that collaborative discussion prior to something happening, so you can talk about what that might look like. We do have in, I believe, the last slide, some resources, and one of those resources that I've provided is a link to the National ICAC Task Force, and that includes contact information for each state and region. There are 61 task forces in the country. Some states do have more than one task force, and which is why I say regional task force. But find out who your task force agency representative is, and it will be a law enforcement or a prosecutor kind of an agency, in order to learn, who your local contact might be and what other resources might be available to you through the ICAC. Heather also mentioned NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also an excellent resource. They have educational programming, presentations, materials, references, resources you can use and incorporate into your programming in your area that are all, I'll say, age appropriate, for children, as well as parent groups as well. So with that, really the three takeaways I wanted to provide for you today. I wanted to empower you with information about what we're seeing, so you have that level of awareness. And then I want you all to think about ways you can be proactive, and then things you can do to be prepared. That's the if-when. So trends. One of the things we've been seeing is an increase in volume. And Heather, talked about what they're seeing at Gaggle. We're seeing that as well. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children provides cyber tips to the various ICAC task forces. Those are referrals from electronic service providers. So by federal law, when service providers become aware of child exploitation materials on their servers, on their systems, or their systems being used in furtherance of child exploitation, they have to refer that to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Department of Justice is the repository or clearinghouse, if you will, for all referrals to the state of Wisconsin. So that might be a victim identified in Wisconsin or a suspect identified, or both, in the state of Wisconsin. In calendar year 2019, Wisconsin received about 2,700 cyber tips. Calendar year 2020, we received about 3,500 cyber tips. First quarter 2021, we've already received over 1,100 cyber tips. Folks have asked me, you know, Matt, is this a COVID trend? We've got more children at home. We've got children with devices and online. We've got parents or people who are interested in exploiting children. Maybe they've got better or more access because they're at home or not in an office setting or whatever the case may be. I don't know that that's driving it. I really don't suspect that. As you can see here, we are first quarter 2021. Many schools are back in person, and our numbers are increasing exponentially. This is a trending, and has been for 20 years since the birth of the internet. This is a trending issue, trending topic, and we can't blame COVID. We can't blame access to technology. This is a real problem, and we need to be aware of that. Another thing that we're also seeing is age associated with children who are either exposed to exploitation. It's decreasing. Children as young as 8, 9, 10. And so this really is important at all levels. And the other thing we're seeing too is increased extortion and graphic materials, a desire for more and more graphic content from children. The website Pornhub was mentioned. So adult commercially, I'll say available websites being used as a mechanism for exploitation. So someone obtains explicit images of a child or a video of a child, threatens to post those on a commercially available website, or, you know, the or being, or send me more graphic content. And so, as we'll discuss, and Dr. Stroman will discuss some of the implications for children on this. Our children are experiencing very adult situations, and they need to have trusted adults they can talk to about this, which is why I'm so glad so many of you are here today to have this conversation. We're seeing live interactions. So using technologies that you're all familiar with, likely TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, which I understand is not necessarily live, but video, Omegle, Twitch, it really runs the gamut. And one of the things we do in Wisconsin is we take the electronic service provider information that we obtain from NECMEC, and we create a pie chart as far as, you know, what ESPs are reporting information. It's not a perfect data set. Obviously, it's one data set. And so it just kind of gives a nice picture as far as what we're seeing, the different kinds of tools for exploitation purposes. But it's important to remember that any platform that allows people to connect theoretically could be a mechanism for exploitation. And so that's the accessibility to people. We've got apps that are location-based apps. So people who want to victimize children can use particular apps with location, geolocation functionality, and find people who are very close to them. So just a lot of things on the technology side to be aware of, which segues into my next set of bullet points, which is the education side. Do as much as you can to educate not only yourself, your colleagues, but also parents, students, law enforcement. Build those relationships, have the conversations so that you can be best prepared to understand what the response will be like. There are a lot of resources through NECMEC, through the National ICAC, some of the things we're doing in Wisconsin, and I do have a link available if you are interested in learning more. We do an internet safety podcast every 2 weeks that we release that talk about different kinds of new technologies, mental health, you name it. You might find that to be a nice resource. We also have a program called Interact, which is designed to be interactive. So it's a web-based, folks can log in and work through different modules to learn about internet safety, broadly or specific topics. It's designed to be interactive. So you click on things, answer questions, have conversations, and we're hoping that that will be a meaningful experience to help people learn about this topic. So feel free to take a look at those and also reach out to your state or regional ICAC to see what resources might be available for you and others you work with. It's really about having that open dialogue, opening lines of communication, and staying current, because things we're talking about right now didn't exist a year, 2 years ago. So it's important to keep up, ask children about the technologies. You know, they're the experts. Find out what folks are using and learn as much as you can about this and the tools that are being used. And then be prepared. You know, we take a victim-centered approach. We've actually integrated a victim services component into our ICAC investigations. Remember that when children come to us, they're coming to us in a place of trust. They're recognizing that they've made mistakes. They've put themselves in positions that have facilitated or led towards, I'll say victimization, but putting them in a place where they've, you know, been a part of this. Or maybe they've seen something and they want to be able to share it. And they want to know that they can trust the people they're talking to. Maybe they've committed a policy violation using a school device. Maybe they've broken a law. They need to know that they can come forward and explain what's happening so the school and law enforcement can best position them to work through what they've experienced, but also help others that may have been exposed. And identify people who are victimizing children. So remember, they're coming to us from a place of trust, and we need to do whatever we can to help facilitate that. Preserving information. If you're working with school devices or school servers or systems, working with your IT folks in case IP addresses or other communications need to be preserved, that could be critical to criminal investigations or something you're looking at from a school perspective. So just remember, this information can go away or disappear very quickly. When you talk about companies like Snapchat, which is why it's so important to integrate law enforcement as quickly as possible, we need to preserve data from service providers. And if we don't do that very quickly, that information could disappear. So that's why it's so important to have the conversations, build the relationships, talk with your local police or sheriff's offices to learn about what this looks like, make those connections, start thinking about this, and position yourself so not if, but when you become aware of something happening with one of your students specifically, or perhaps, as was suggested earlier, groups of students that are engaged in this, you can be best positioned to respond from a school or district perspective, as well as integrating other investigative organizations as you might need to do so. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Strowan.
Thank you. I think it's Director Joy or Commander Joy. I don't know, you have so many titles. So thank you. That's such great information. And I'm sure you're going to have some people write in about all the acronyms because there's so many in law enforcement that we deal with. So thank you for that. It was great. I want to, we have so much information. I think Gaggle has done so much to open the door in terms of giving us the content and the data. And I think that Heather pointing out the fact that the information and the statistics, when I jump into these two areas, I tried to put out probably a little bit more information just because I know these slides are going to be given to the people that are attending and who have signed up for it. So if you have people that you want to recommend, again, this recording will be offered to those people that sign up, and there's so much really good information from the school level, from law enforcement perspectives, and then I think clinically what I'm seeing. My biggest fear here, particularly with the selfies and what Matt was just sharing there, is that there's so many different providers. So you have Omegle, you have Twitch, you have Snapchat, Instagram, like the kids basically, if we go in, I did a task force investigation into LiveMe several years ago, and we shut down 600,000 accounts where we had kids under the age of 10 involved. And I just went back in with that same group and investigators, and we saw that they have probably double the amount of kids under 10 back again. So it really is a little bit like whack-a-mole. And the selfie world itself is really kind of that first step into kind of just testing out the waters in these online worlds for kids. So as a clinician, what I see is obviously depressed mood. I see anxiety. The more time that they're actually putting themselves out there, the mood that they have in return basically starts to fail. Their body image starts to decompensate because, of course, they're comparing themselves to these highly filtered and retouched peers that are on there. So that's why we're going to go through some of the issues here. And then one more comment before I jump into these different segments is the numbers that Heather went over, and as Matt wrote into the comment section, that this is what he's seen in Wisconsin. I think nationally, multiple states, California, New York, Georgia, there's several cases or states that I've been working with. And I think this is a national issue because our kids are going online. And what her numbers show is almost 281% increase in elementary school. And when you look down at the middle school, you have an increase of 96%, and then it drops to 36%. Those are all increases, which we should be alarmed by. But what I look at is that elementary school increase of 281% of that in that area where kids are starting to investigate, because we probably did have parents that were paying attention and keeping things locked down until this pandemic started. So anyway, I just wanted to touch base on those numbers a little bit and give context of why I see that clinically happening, because I have parents scrambling on my end, calling me and asking me, what do I do? Because I know that they need access academically, but they're not using it for academic purposes. So let's talk a little bit about selfies and why I think it's kind of the gateway into some of these darker worlds. Because I think that kids are, taking pictures of themselves, and you watch them and they have devices and they might be, doing the little lips, or they might be, I'm just taking a shot to send a friend. But it pretty quickly can become addictive in that sense. So that first piece is, are they doing it on a daily basis? Are they trying to keep up a streak on a certain app with a friend? Or are they actually spending more time thinking about whether or not they've got that image that they're going to send out that looks the best? And that's when it can kind of fall into what, from a scientific and clinical perspective, we look at this addictive potential. So if you have addiction in your background, selfies and technology can become addictive, and that's that dopamine reward pathway that kids have in their brains as well. And so selfies, to me, may seem pretty innocent on the outset, but they can lead into deeper and darker areas, because again, what gets rewarded on those images that we send are those that look cuter, have a little bit more potential into being sexualized and things like that. And I will remind you, and I know that Matt knows this as well, is that there's a lot of third-party apps that go out there and pull images. And so those technologies exist right now, where if you have a pouty faced lip or you have a certain percentage of skin showing, there are apps out there that go in and pull that content from those delivered images across the online world, and house those into sites that we have then no access to, because they're typically outside of the United States. We have a hard time pulling those back. So that addictive piece, you need to really pay attention to. If they're starting to do it more often, you're starting to see some of those behaviors, definitely pay attention to what those look like. Pay attention, and we'll talk a little bit about how to lock that down in a bit. The second area that I feel is really important is hurting relationships. And this isn't just relationships that in middle school and high school, we're kind of testing out our waters of romantic relationships with others. It's also just friendships. So the more often that we're spending time focusing on ourselves and making our image the best, and we're not paying attention to social cues around us, particularly in this year coming forward, where we're going to be leaving the quarantined houses and going back into the real world, which is already going to be potentially difficult socially. The fact that we've leaned into and have such a high level of selfie distribution happening, it's going to be even harder, because that's what the rest of this peer group is seeing, and it challenges so much, I think, when we don't pay attention to how it impacts those relationships and building those those different worlds with other peers in those settings. So again, Selfies is kind of that beginning part of where we stop looking at groups, which does definitely, if you took group photos that you put out there with other peers in it, tend to be boosting of self-esteem, and they tend to identify someone with more self-confidence. So it definitely does impact relationships in that respect. The third one is like probably more for the high school level, middle school, high school, if even internships, job perspectives, but anything that they're putting out there today, you know, I just kind of cringe that I have moms that come to me today that have kindergartners and first graders, and they're like, you know, I put a lot of posts out there in college that I'm really embarrassed about, and my kids can find it. This is the internet. So all of that data, for whatever reason, is being saved, and it's accessible if you know the right way to start searching it up. So, you know, I have parents now of very small children that are saying, you know, I've got information out there that's hurting me just because of these silly selfies that they started putting out there when they were first introduced to technology back in their high school years. And so kids nowadays, particularly those that are wanting to go and get jobs or internships or things like that, it's kind of a standard where everybody is looking through that and definitely taking account of what it is that this kid is doing. And if you see someone that's posting in like a ton of times, and you understand that that might take away from their work ethic, or it might hurt the brand of your company, those are some conversations that we need to definitely filter in. We do that in our teen program, and we definitely do it through DCA, because I think it's so important that kids understand the longer term effects of keeping a clean kind of a digital footprint for themselves. And then lastly, again, selfies, it seems probably easy to assume this narcissistic effect that can happen, where it's this impression that they're only about themselves. Of course, I've got this tech acquired narcissism that I always talk about, because I don't necessarily think that most of the kids that fall into that category naturally would have been there had it not been for the influence of this online world. And what they get is rewarded for putting themselves out there in a very narcissistic, self-focused way. And oftentimes now, because of the pandemic, it's very easy to do, because we've got families that are trying to work from home, or, you know, everybody's in their own room on their devices, like trying to do things. So that ability to really focus in on themselves really is training them and creating a personality typology that I don't think I've ever seen prior to this in my history of working with online safety and the psychological impacts of technology that I've seen today. And mostly because of the TikToks and mostly because of the Instagrams, which they're so visualized and they're so in tuned with really building up the brand and the person that gets rewarded on screen. And so that's this algorithmic cycle of wanting to post and getting that feedback that really is altering kind of the personalities of these younger kids, which terrifies me when I look at some of the stats that Gaggle brings to me on a weekly basis of what they're seeing on their end. So this is where I think that, again, like a lot of people might look at selfies, and why I always advocate having a conversation for it, because it's certainly not what Matt has to worry about on a daily basis. You know, a kid just putting a selfie out there with their face and, you know, trying to put themselves out there in the world. It's what the selfie leads to, and what the training and the practice does for them, and how the world responds to them on the other end of it, because that's the challenge that I mostly see on my end. Okay, so rolling into the explicit content, and obviously we can talk about it in various ways, but I really wanted to start out with, most importantly, that it's not just a video and it's not just a post that we have to go and clean up, or we have to, from a law enforcement's perspective, go back and figure out what to do with, if there's going to be charges or not charges, because there's, you know, children and adults involved. It has such a larger consequence. The ripple effect of this post that kids are having, Ryan was talking about his student. The ripple effect of that is not only on administration and his level, it's on the legal perspective and who he has to report that to as a mandated reporter when they're required to, and then the parents that get involved, the peers that are influenced by it. So one simple post has huge consequences that bleed out, that can lead to months, if not years, of impact on these children. So that's the part that I struggle with, trying to communicate as much as I can about why it's so important to do the very simple educational piece with kids, so that they don't ever are in those situations that they have to make those decisions. So inappropriate content addiction, I use addiction in here because I think it's important that we recognize that it can be. It doesn't always necessarily lead to that, but on average, because in the US, we have kids prior to the pandemic getting their first device around 6 or 7 years of age. There's different varying statistics. I know we put one up earlier that by 11 years old, children have typically seen pornography, or they've been introduced to it. It's more on a chronic basis by that age, but it becomes earlier than that. And this statistic in the front, that 10% of 7th graders actually worry that they're addicted to a pornographic site. We're talking 11 and 12-year-olds. So keep that in mind, that 10% of them are worried that they don't know how to stop. And so whether you want to call it addiction, or whether you want to call it overuse, they have a real concern on their end privately, that they don't know whether or not they can stop it. And they probably don't at that age know how to have conversations about it. So again, this goes back to working in partnership of getting sight in and looking at what these kids are doing and what they're struggling with, and figuring out ways to have conversation and normalizing this conversation with them, because we know it's happening. We know that they're viewing it, and we know it has massive repercussions if we don't. So by the time it hits Matt's plate, by the time Ryan has to deal with it at an administrative level, I'm usually the third arm in that, where it comes to me from a psychological perspective, where families are like, we can't erase this from their brains. And I'm not really sure what to do with it. And it's very, very difficult to challenge the families in having these open conversations and dealing with it, so that they don't fall back into those places. And again, we're talking very, very young kids that are dealing with it. The second one, if you suspect that they're seeing it, I really want you to understand that, as alarmed and scary as it feels as a school personnel, and maybe how we communicate that with our parents is important, but we want to come back and say, look, we recognize this is happening. We understand that because of this past year, there's a massive influence. If you're in elementary school, I mean, you're looking at 281% increase of kids that are looking at explicit material, and at middle school, it's 96% increase. So that's a huge amount of increase. And so I think that you have to come to parents and say, look, this is a national trend that we're seeing. It's something that's happening. We want to be an advocate for you and help you with your child. And here's what we think we can help you with. And that's where getting them the help that they need, whether it's with the school counselor, whether or not it's at a level where that child needs to go and talk to a professional. It's been shown that cognitive behavioral therapy has been really helpful. I know that Gaggle has launched Gaggle therapy. So they also have a resource on board that those schools that have access to that can access that for the families. But certainly have a conversation where you have a professional engaged, so that you can respond to that without making the child feel broken, or that they've done something like incredibly wrong. Because I think that there's that really tenuous area with this young undeveloped brain on whether or not we normalize some behaviors, and that we talk about what's okay in other behaviors. And so that's the educational piece and the therapeutic piece that needs to happen in these situations. And then finally, I think that talking about the how you can protect your children from pornography, certainly understand what they're on. If you are not in control of their iCloud or their Apple ID or whatever it is that they're using, and you have no idea what they're downloading on their phone, or the amount of data that is being transmitted from their phone, and you don't understand what that translates to, you need to start there. I have a family that had 4 children aged 10 to 15. And I said, you know what, I just want you to do an audit. I have some suspicions that something might be going on. And they found porn on 3 of the children's phones, and they found a drafted suicide note on the 4th. So I think that a lot of parents, a lot of educators are like, what is our role in this? Should we actually be looking? Is this a privacy issue? And I want to be really crystal clear. I've been doing this for almost 20 years since technology has come out. There is no privacy that the children should be afforded in the situation where you have such an influence from things like TikTok or Instagram or WhatsApp or any of these, Snapchat, all of these apps that are bringing content to your kids. Know what they're looking at, have conversations with them. It's super important, because as a clinician, that is where they're sharing information. And that is why I am so strongly an advocate for getting education to peers, so that they can become, instead of like snitches getting stitches, when they find out that kids are doing something, people who care share. And that's kind of my messaging when I'm talking with kids, is because working with one of the parents of the Columbine shooters, she shared with me, if I just would have known, if I just would have been able to hear what was going on in his head, that in those situations, oftentimes when you have kids that are getting off the rails, they're telling peers, and the peers really don't know what to do with that information. And as professionals in this field, whether we're in education or in law enforcement or therapeutically, it's really hard to respond if they've gone so far. So we've got to get the kids involved in that. And we as parents and educators need to pay attention to what's being posted. And then there's other information on here about why you want to make sure that you understand the legal ramifications. I think that Matt covered all that. And I think that you need to recognize that there are state mandates, there are also federal mandates. So, anytime a child is posting something that is inappropriate, that shows body parts, it's a crime. And if it goes to an adult, it's super crime. I'll say it that way, but that you can be charged under multiple things in those situations. And every time a child shares that information, it really does cause problems. So I will stop there, hopefully leaving almost 10 minutes for questions and conversation, because all of you need, I think, to understand and have access to such amazing content that we've done today. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you all, Matt, Ryan, and Heather, for your contributions. Lots of interesting stuff. We have some questions that have come in. So I'm just going to jump right in. And please, if you all think of any while we're going through this part of the webinar, please post that in either the chat or the question panel. And I'm going to try to keep to it's 7 minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly here. But the first question's for Matt Joy. So Matt, this is a question the person's asking, saying, my district policies are in conflict with certain law enforcement practices regarding interviewing children, notifications of parents, etc. Do you have any thoughts on how to navigate that? That would be appreciated.
Okay, yeah. We do see that. School district policy may require parent notification prior to law enforcement conducting an interview or speaking with a child. That's why it's so important to have these conversations in advance. Maybe even consider building like a multidisciplinary team. So administrators, educators, school social work, guidance counselor type folks, law enforcement personnel, maybe a representative from the district attorney's office. Let's talk about why this district has this particular policy or practice in place. Let's talk about why law enforcement has a particular policy or practice in place. My hope is that we're all hoping for the same resolution, and that being providing resources to the child or children to help them move forward in the best way possible, holding people accountable for victimizing people in such I'll say horrific way, educating people, etc. So we've all got the same goal here. Let's figure out how we can work together to facilitate this. So that's why it's so imperative to not wait until a child comes forward or you get information from Gaggle or something happens. Start the conversations now. Let's talk about this. Let's look at our policies and practices and learn from one another on why we're doing this or recommending these kinds of things, and see how we can resolve, if there is conflict, so to speak, how can we resolve that and work forward in a positive way?
Super. Thanks. That's great. Let's see, we have another question coming in with relation to something that Heather, Matt, and Lisa all talked to, which is the content that is coming in that needs to be, you know, what we call quarantined at Gaggle, you know, it's really important that that is dealt with properly for a variety of reasons. So the question is to Heather, could you just talk a little bit more to what Gaggle does about that so that it keeps the, I mean, are the kids actually receiving the images, and what happens if the adults get it on their machines and that sort of thing?
Sure. When we quarantine an image, that just removes the student from having access to that file, which means they can't access it and they can't share it. Anything that we put into a quarantine status is also reported to NCMEC because it is that level of severity. So the districts, our partners all know anytime we submit an image through the cyber tips that Matt Joy referenced, we let them know with the Gaggle notification that goes over to them, and that the image has been quarantined. But administrators and then of course law enforcement would always be able to access that image for any of their reasons. But that's only a certain access level at that point, which is that level of protection, because we want to make sure you're also not, sharing it or viewing it inappropriately as well. So we're never going to send anything to you or anything like that.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying that,
Yes,
Heather.
good question.
Yeah. All right. So Brian, as an administrator, here's a question. What are some additional technology concerns that you're seeing in your school?
I'm sure the fellow administrators on have all kinds of stories as well, especially with again, like Lisa said, this transition back to school and the increased use of technology. But also, like Dr. Sherman said, it's like playing whack-a-mole. We have apps that even Matt mentioned, all the social media apps that are out there that we as administrators really can't control. We don't have a whole lot of control over those cell phones that the parents allow the students to have. But we are seeing problems with that. But things that Gaggle and resources that can catch are things like self-harm. So we're seeing students writing self-harm emails, writing self-harm documents that are more and more that we're seeing more and more, because in this transition, we're also noticing we have a 50% increase in appointments with our school counselor right now. Some students are having a much more difficult time transitioning back. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that, but also, like Matt said, we work with local law enforcement. The threats that we're seeing are self-harm, but there's also threats to other students that are happening electronically. So I think it's really important that we build those relationships with the law enforcement, but also educate our teachers on what to report. Sometimes we're finding that is a problem of, we need to let our teachers know, wait a minute, you can't handle this on your level. This should really be escalated. And that's, I think, an important piece that we have to talk about. And as a parent myself at the elementary age, my kids don't have social media, my kids don't have phones. But what I can tell you is I'm still hearing them come home, talk about self-image. I'm having talk about, selfies or joke about selfies. So as much as I try to shelter my kids as much as I can, I know it's out there. So I think educating the parents on what's out there and educating the students, whether or not the parents say, my kid doesn't have social media, they're still exposed to it.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you, everyone. I'm going to just go to the next slide because I want to share with everybody before we wrap up that we will be sending these slides to everybody along with the recording for this webinar in the next couple of days. But on this slide, which is the last slide, you will find some resources. Matt Joy mentioned some resources. These are down here. These are links, and Gaggle has some resources. We've been posting a few in the chat, but in case you didn't catch those, definitely check these out here. And obviously, Dr. Lisa Stroman has her site, and she's on social media, and she has a great curriculum, her Digital Citizen Academy program, which is very helpful for, you know, helping kids understand better all of these, how to navigate all of this. So with that, I want to thank the panelists again. Thank you so much for taking the time today and sharing your knowledge and your experience with all of the attendees, and thank you all of the attendees for joining us. So with that, I'm going to wish everyone a good rest of your day, and join us again for another webinar from Gaggle. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.